At some point, most people have this moment. You're scrolling late at night. Maybe it's YouTube. Maybe it's Reddit. Maybe it's another financial podcast playing while you clean the kitchen. And you realize something uncomfortable. You actually understand this stuff now. You know what an emergency fund is. You know you should spend less than you earn. You know debt compounds against you and investments compound for you. And yet, your situation doesn't feel very different. The stress is still there. The checking account still feels fragile. One unexpected expense still throws everything off. And that thought creeps in. If I know all this, why am I still here? Most people never say that part out loud. They just assume something is wrong with them. But that question is the doorway to understanding what's really going on. Here's the part most financial content skips. Staying broke isn't usually about not knowing what to do. It's about what happens between knowing and doing. We treat money like it's a math problem. Learn the formula, plug in the numbers, get the result. But money doesn't live on a spreadsheet. It lives inside real life. Inside stress, habits, identity, relationships, and fear. So when someone learns about money and nothing changes, they assume they failed. But that's backwards. The system failed to account for how humans actually behave. Most financial education is built for a version of you who's calm, rational, and emotionally neutral. A version of you who doesn't exist after a long workday, a stressful commute, rising rent, and a phone full of reminders of how far behind you feel. So let's slow this down and talk honestly about why learning about money doesn't automatically translate into financial progress. The first reason is subtle, but powerful. Information doesn't replace emotional wiring. You can understand compound interest and still overspend. You can understand budgeting and still avoid looking at your account. Because money behavior isn't driven by intelligence. It's driven by emotion. Stress makes people short-term thinkers. Anxiety narrows your time horizon. Exhaustion makes convenience feel necessary. When you're financially stressed, your brain isn't asking, what's optimal long-term? It's asking, what gets me through this week? That's why people who know better still swipe the card, still put things on payment plans, still delay decisions they intellectually understand. It's not ignorance. It's overload. Another reason people stay broke after learning about money is that knowledge often increases pressure before it increases progress. Once you know the rules, every mistake feels louder. You don't just spend money anymore. You judge yourself for spending money. You don't just miss a savings goal. You replay it in your head as proof you're behind. That internal pressure creates avoidance. People stop checking their accounts. They stop opening bills right away. They stop tracking anything because tracking feels like a reminder of failure. Ironically, learning about money can make people more anxious before it makes them more capable. And anxiety is not a good foundation for consistency. There's also something else that rarely gets discussed. Learning about money doesn't automatically change your environment. You still wake up to the same job, the same bills, the same expectations, the same social pressures. You might learn that lifestyle inflation is dangerous, but you're still surrounded by people upgrading cars, apartments, and vacations. You might learn that saving is important, but rent just went up and groceries cost more than they used to. So even though your mindset is evolving, your circumstances are still applying pressure. That gap between what you know and what your life allows creates frustration. And frustration often turns into resignation. Watching financial content feels productive. It feels like movement. And emotionally, it scratches the same itch as actual progress. But learning is passive. Building stability is active. It requires repetition, boredom, and patience. 3 things humans are notoriously bad at when they're stressed. There's also identity. This part is uncomfortable, but important. Most people don't realize how much their financial behavior is tied to who they believe they are. If you've spent years feeling bad with money, that identity doesn't disappear just because you watched a few videos. If you grew up around scarcity, instability, or constant financial stress, your nervous system learned patterns long before you learned concepts. So even when the numbers change, your reactions don't. You might make more money and still feel broke. Save more money and still feel unsafe. Reduce debt and still feel behind. Because internally, you're still operating from an old script. And finally, there's timing. Most financial progress is invisible for a long time. Saving the first few $1,000s doesn't change your life. Investing small amounts doesn't feel impactful. Paying off debt early doesn't free up much cash. So people assume it's not working. They don't quit because they're lazy. They quit because the feedback loop is too slow. Humans are wired to respond to immediate results. Money systems reward patience. That mismatch keeps a lot of people stuck. Here's the shift that changes everything. Financial progress isn't about knowing more. It's about building systems that work even when you're tired, stressed, and imperfect. Once you stop treating money as a test of discipline and start treating it as a design problem, things soften. Instead of asking, "Why can't I stick to this?" you start asking, "What's making this hard to stick to?" That's a very different question. When you see money as something you manage with systems instead of willpower, the shame starts to loosen its grip. You stop needing to be perfect. You stop needing to feel motivated. You just need things set up in a way that reduces friction. That shift also reframes being broke. Being broke isn't a moral failure. It's often the result of operating without buffers in a world that constantly applies pressure. Once you understand that, you stop blaming yourself for struggling and start focusing on stability first, optimization later. And that's where real progress begins. So what does this actually look like in real life? It looks like prioritizing calm over cleverness. Instead of chasing the perfect budget, you focus on making your finances easier to manage. Fewer accounts, fewer decisions, fewer moments where you have to rely on self-control at the end of a long day. It looks like building a small margin before chasing big goals. Even a modest buffer between income and expenses changes how your brain operates. It creates breathing room. And breathing room makes consistency possible. It looks like separating learning from implementation. Instead of consuming endless financial content, you pause and ask, "What's one thing I can quietly stabilize over the next few months?" Not optimize. Stabilize. It looks like adjusting expectations. Most people don't transform their finances quickly. They slowly remove sources of chaos. One bill paid off. One habit simplified. One system automated. That kind of progress doesn't feel dramatic, but it compounds emotionally before it compounds financially. And it looks like being kinder to yourself during the process. Because shame doesn't build wealth. Consistency does. If you've learned about money and still feel stuck, that doesn't mean you failed. It means you're human. It means you're trying to apply abstract knowledge inside a real life filled with stress, uncertainty, and responsibility. The goal isn't to become perfect with money. It's to make money feel less heavy, less noisy, less constant. And that happens slowly, through systems that support you even on bad days. Progress doesn't always look like numbers going up. Sometimes it looks like fewer sleepless nights, fewer moments of panic, more trust in your ability to handle what comes next. You don't need to know more. You need space, patience, and structures that work with who you are. And if all you do this month is understand yourself a little better around money, that's not nothing. That's how change actually starts.